Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the top 10 albums by prog rock giants turned pop perfectionists Genesis. Genesis formed at Charterhouse School in Surrey in the south of England in 1967. They were originally called Garden Wall, which you have to admit is probably not the best band name you've ever heard. They were spotted by minor pop star Jonathan King, who persuaded them to change their name to Genesis and managed to maneuver a deal for the band with Decca Records. They released their debut album From Genesis to Revelation in 1969 while they were still at school on a summer break. It was a bit of a commercial failure, and the members went their separate ways until they reconvened not too long afterwards. They went to a cottage in the country and rehearsed for hours and hours a day, became a much better, more interesting band, and eventually signed with Charisma, and so started their long journey into prog rock history with their inimitable English sense of humour and quirkiness. As I'm sure you know, Genesis are very much two bands, possibly even three. And I think more than any other band, they morphed into something very different as they went on. And although the band has had various lineups, undoubtedly I think for rock fans the classic lineup is Peter Gabriel on vocals, Phil Collins on drums, Steve Hackett on guitar, Tony Banks on keyboards, and Mike Rutherford on bass guitar. I think rock history judges the Peter Gabriel early Genesis very favourably, but the pop band I'm not so sure. Undoubtedly they had some great songs and some monster hits, but I wonder if the image of that later band is tarnished a bit unfairly by sort of the Phil Collins and his solo stuff with, the sort of suit-wearing corporate 80s pop star image that he gave off occasionally. To say nothing of the early fans who must have thought that the band had sold out completely. And, is that fair comment? I don't know. Was the band just changing with the times? We can probably discuss that as we proceed. But we've got a lot to get through, so let's crack on. And at number 10... I'm going to put their 13th album from 1986, Invisible Touch. Now this was a monster of a record. It sold over 7 million copies. They became the first non-US act to have 5 songs from the same album reach the top 5 on the Billboard charts. Invisible Touch, the song itself, was their first US #1 single. So you think, well, that's all great, isn't it? But, a lot of people hated this album. Why? Well, I think, it's such a different beast from the band they originally had been. A lot of people thought it was too similar to Phil Collins' solo work. But I think, you just have to accept this album on its own terms. Yes, it's full of 80s poppy production, but there's no denying it has some good tunes. The band had a bit of a break and they'd all gone off to do solo stuff, and in that time Phil Collins had become an even bigger solo star than he already was, so it's possible that he was using a little bit of that clout to influence the recording and the sound of the record. But you've got Land of Confusion, Invisible Touch, In Too Deep, Tonight, lovely Throwing It All Away, a track I've always really liked, and that's an impressive backbone for any record. There's still the tiniest throwback to prog with the two-parter Domino, but no one was really fooled. The band, in no discernible way really by now, was a prog, the progmeisters of the days of yore. And there's a prog album title for you already, Progmeisters of the days of yore. This album is constantly put near the bottom of great Genesis album lists, and I think that's unfair. I think sometimes you just have to recognise that something's been made that appeals to an awful lot of people, and that's certainly the case with this album, whether it's for the Genesis purists or not. At number 9, I'm going to put their 12th album from 1983, Genesis. Biogenesis. This was the first album to be recorded entirely in their own studio, the farm in Surrey. And it was also written entirely democratically. Previously, they'd all brought things to the table and worked on it, but this time they all wrote together in the studio. Hence the title. So it probably marks the point, this album, where the band really had cast off their previous prog rock robes, and really now they were undoubtedly a pop band. So it is a new beginning in many ways. Hence the title and everything. It's a restart, and of course it's produced by Hugh Padgham, a legendary producer. I think Mike Rutherford has said he felt the band had gone as far as it could possibly go with the music they were doing before, and so this was a very deliberate move to make the songs shorter, catchier, and more radio friendly. And it opens with The Striking Mama, which I think is a great track, and then moves into the sort of quite Beatlesy That's All, which I enjoy. Home by the Sea, the sort of fairly ridiculous Illegal Alien, which a lot of people don't like at all, but got to admit it's kind of catchy. Perhaps not every track hits home on this album, but you could argue the whole thing is kind of refreshing, and reflecting the changing times. And I think that's exactly what they were trying to do. Mike Rutherford does say it's one of his favourites, and the album did win a Grammy for the best rock album by a duo or group with a vocal, whatever that means. Some of these Grammy categorizations, I have no idea what they're on about. At number 8 from 1980, I'm going to put their 10th album, Duke. Now this album's kind of very much the bridge between, I think, the band's early prog days and the pop band they were becoming. And it's buoyed up by some really good hit singles. You've got Misunderstanding and the fabulous Turn It On Again on here, which has got sort of kind of a little mini sort of prog thing of its own. It was their first UK #1 album, and it went platinum in the UK and in the US. I think some of the drums sound really great on this album, though it is for the first time, the album where for the first time you hear a drum machine on Duchess. They're moving towards these shorter pop tunes. There are some prog leanings. You've got the 8-minute Duke's Travels on here. The album sort of arose out of some personal turmoil that Phil Collins was having, because he'd gone to Canada to try and salvage his marriage, and it hadn't worked out at all. And some of the songs that he had written in this time went on Face Value, of course, a sort of famous album about the breakup of his marriage. And In the Air Tonight could have been one of those songs that ended up on this album, but it didn't, and possibly should have done, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford have since said. But he did offer Misunderstanding and Alone Tonight, which are both good tracks. Rutherford and Banks each offered 2 of their songs, and the rest was all sort of written in the studio. Most of it works, though you could argue that it falls a little bit between two stools, the pop and the prog. So we can call it pop prog and split the difference. It's important to note that on these 3 albums that I've just talked about, the band was now just to 3 people. It was Phil Collins, who had taken over the vocals and the drum duties, Tony Banks on keyboards, and Mike Rutherford taking on guitar and bass duties. But we will talk about who has left and when as we carry on, because now we're into sort of the more prog genesis. At number 7, I'm going to put their 8th album from 1976, The Wind and the Wuthering. This was their first album recorded outside of the UK. This was recorded in Holland. They found out that they could actually save some money by recording abroad, so they all thought that was a wonderful idea, of course. Now, this is notably their last album with Steve Hackett, and that's an important change, because Steve Hackett, of course, a wonderful guitar player. The internal frustrations were growing. I think Steve Hackett felt that his contributions were being overlooked quite a bit. The album got to number 7 in the UK, and it got to number 26 in the USA. Helped a little bit by Your Own Special Way, which was the band's first charting single in the USA, which reached number 62. And one thing I like about this album, it feels like there's a little bit more space on this album. I guess that's something that's sort of reflected in the title of the album and in the artwork as well. It's not quite as intense as a lot of their earlier work, and it does have a nice flow to it. One for the Vine is a good track, and the whole thing is quite positively received by the critics. And I think, by now it sort of shows the band mellowing a little bit, almost as if they sort of accomplished what they'd wanted to accomplish with the albums prior to this, perhaps moving a little bit further away from the sort of Peter Gabriel stylings of the earlier days. It is still unashamedly a prog album, there's no doubt about that, and perhaps just perhaps one without quite so many sort of time changes and sweeps and movements as we've got used to with Genesis. It's a very popular album with Tony Banks, apparently. And number 6 from 1970, I'm going to put their second album, Trespass. This was the first kind of Genesis sounding album, I guess, because their debut from Genesis to Revelation really was just a collection of orchestrated pop songs that didn't really suit the band at all. Fairly listenable, but quite forgettable as well. So on this album, they have Anthony Phillips on guitar and John Mayhew on drums, and in both cases, their last album with the band. In Mayhew's case, it's one and only album with the band. And I sort of quite like this album. It has an acoustic folky flavour, which I always enjoy. I like the sound. I mean, it's not as dense as they would become on some later albums. The most famous track on here is The Knife, which became a real live favourite. And it was actually edited down for a single, though, which failed to chart. I mean, in the early days, you must remember Genesis had some pretty dismal commercial failures. I think in many ways the important aspect of this album is in bringing Peter Gabriel to the fore, and away from the sort of restrictive pop songs they were doing on the debut album. It enabled him to take centre stage and start taking on guises vocally, lyrically, that he would explore in much more depth later on in his career with the band. Of course, some of it's a little bit preposterous, but that's okay, because I'm a sucker at the end of the day for some acoustic folk prog pop, not pop, but some acoustic folk prog, and Trespass fits the bill very, very nicely. Prog pop. There's all too many kinds of music flying around. Number 5 from 1971. I'm going to put their third album, Nursery Crime. This is the crucial third album because it's where Phil Collins and Steve Hackett come on board, and you have the classic lineup I mentioned earlier. And I think really sort of from here on in with this list, we're into the real sort of meat of the Genesis sandwich, which again sounds like some sort of weird Spinal Tap prog album title. It opens with the absolutely classic music box, and immediately you can hear the band's personality has been turned up a little bit, and the oddballness that would come to define the band for many years afterwards. It's suddenly all there. The album, again, it failed to chart until 3 years later in 1974 after some extensive touring. So, commercially, the band's stock's still very, very low. And critically, this album had some mixed reviews. Quite a few pompous reviewers dismissed it as overblown, pretentious nonsense. But look, if you're going to write a review for songs about the spirit of a man trapped in a musical box that tries to escape and seduce the lady of the house, no ship, Sherlock. What were they expecting? It just baffles me sometimes that reviewers can call things pretentious. This is pop music we're talking about, and prog music, and that's what it's there for. Why has my voice gone so high? I don't know. It has to be said, at the time, it was said at the time that this album brought on the new genre of music called Edwardian rock, which is a description that I absolutely love. I think we need more Edwardian rock, and we can throw in some Georgian rock and some Victorian rock as well. And I may even start a Tudor rock band called Henry VIII. Geddy Lee, no less, rates this as one of the 10 greatest albums of all time, so it must be good, and it is. And for me, this is the start of the real Genesis, and I think it's influenced no end of prog bands since, from Rush to Marillion and many in between. So I guess the controversy starts here at number 4, because I'm going to put their 6th album from 1974, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I know, number 4 only. This is regarded as one of the great concept albums, and it's most of the time it's ranked much higher than number 4. But I have a difficult relationship with this album. It's kind of like a girlfriend who I find difficult to be with, but I kind of really miss her when she's not around. It's a double album, but for me it's almost too much. It's too dense for me, and regular watchers of the show know I like a bit of space and air in my music. But it does have some extraordinary moments on it, arguably the finest in the whole Genesis catalogue. The concept and the lyrics were written by Peter Gabriel. It's about a sort of Puerto Rican boy who, living in New York, who finds himself going on all these escapades and adventures. There's much, much more to that, but it's so ridiculous and so convoluted. I don't even know if we'd have time to go through it now. I've never really, to be honest, invested that much in the storyline because it's that ridiculous. I just kind of let the music wash over me, and maybe that's one of the reasons why I've never really really emotionally invested in this album. There were tensions in the band when this was being done because Peter Gabriel was developing the storyline and the lyrics all by himself while the band were working on the music. And, as I said earlier, some of it's absolutely sublime. I think Carpet Crawlers is one of the best songs in the Genesis catalogue. Counting Out Time's a really refreshing groove, and you've got Lily White Lilith, which is a fine rocker as well. Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins have both said that this is their favourite Genesis album, although Steve Hackett said he felt underused on it. But this was to be Peter Gabriel's last album with the band, following, I think, from all those tensions and also from just a sort of irrepressible need to get out there and spread his wings and do great things, which of course he did. Peter Gabriel's solo career has been a very, very illustrious and enjoyable one. It peaked at number 10 in the UK, 41 in the USA, and many, many Genesis fans will tell you that this is the one. I'm not going to argue with them, but I will try and make a case for 3 better records they made. And one of those is their 7th album from 1976, Trick of the Tail. By this point, the band was in a precarious position because Steve Hackett had made a solo record. Peter Gabriel had left to pursue his solo career with great success, and the band was forced to advertise in Melody Maker for a new singer. They didn't quite know what they were going to do. But no one was coming forward and fitting the bill. So they went into the studio still unsure who their singer was going to be until Phil Collins was persuaded to sing a version of Squonk. It worked out really, really well, and the deal was sealed, and Phil Collins came forward to become the band's singer. Musically, though, this album is still kind of vocally, particularly very much in the style of Peter Gabriel, Genesis, and the band admitted that they were sort of trying to write very much with his sort of humorous lyrical stylings, which is, I think, perhaps something they lost eventually a few albums down the line. But do you know what? I have to say I love this album. I think it opens with one of my favourite Genesis tunes, Dance on a Volcano. It's got the lovely ripples on here, the excellent Madman Moon, and Squonk is great. And the album itself, the sound of it is really, really crisp, produced by David Henschel. And the reception for this album was really quite positive, and it reached number 3 in the UK and 31 in the USA. So it stayed in the UK charts for 39 weeks. So clearly something was changing, and commercially Genesis stock was rising and rising. The subsequent tour for this album was also a great success. And incidentally, drum duties on that tour, when Phil Collins was stepping forward and singing, were taken by Bill Bruford from Yes, adding another branch to Pete Frame's Rock Family Trees. Who remembers Rock Family Trees? Brilliant. So, Genesis not only survived the departure of Peter Gabriel, but, you could say that they started really thriving. But let's go back a bit, because in 1972 they made their 4th album, Foxtrot, which I'm putting at number 2 on my list. This sounds to me like a coming of age album, really, where everything really starts falling into place. And it was their first album to chart in the UK, getting to number 12. The band was having some success in Europe on the road at this time, but no commercial success at home. The record label Charisma was very, very keen for the band to sell more albums, as you can imagine, and there were quite a few disputes on this album as to who the producer should be, until David Hitchcock was finally chosen, though still not quite to everybody's satisfaction, but you wouldn't know it. Because this album really, really works for me, and it's particularly because it's bookended by two Genesis classics. It opens with the magnificent Mellotron-led Watcher of the Skies, and then it closes with one of the great Genesis tracks, the 23-minute Supper's Ready. But there's plenty to enjoy in between. Tracks like Timetable and the lovely Steve Hackett showcase, Horizons. When the album was released, it was generally regarded as a real step up from Nursery Crimes and a bit of a turning point for the group. And it did go on to sell 60,000 copies in the UK. And some people still think Supper's Ready is the band's masterpiece. And even Rolling Stone got in on the act by naming this the 14th greatest prog rock album of all time. It's still quite a long album of 51 minutes, but I think it's a 51 minutes that sustains the quality and enjoyment all the way through. So that just leaves us with one album, and I'm sure you've guessed it by now if you know your Genesis albums. It's their last album they made, Calling All Stations. I'm kidding. I'm joking. It's not Calling All Stations. It's their fifth album from 1973, Selling England by the Pound. And this album is often regarded as the best Genesis album. It's certainly a favourite of Steve Hackett, who felt this was the album where everything really did come together. And it contains a really wonderful Genesis moments. It has a loose concept running through it about sort of a loss of English culture, English folk culture, and the kind of Americanization of England. Hence the title. But the highlights are plentiful on this record, not least the wonderful I Know What I Like, which is perhaps, I think, probably my favourite Genesis track, and perhaps their best known Peter Gabriel era track. But you've also got Cinema Show, Firth of Forth, and the absolutely brilliant Battle of Epping Forest. Though, funny enough, the reviews were mixed when this album came out, but I think time has been very, very kind to this album. But also, it's been very kind to the sort of Peter Gabriel era of Genesis in general. Rolling Stone magazine, it reached 7 on the Reader's Poll of Greatest Prog Albums of All Time, and no less than John Lennon himself once said that he liked this album. So, well, where do you go from there? Well, the album went to number 3 in the UK and number 70 in the USA, and I Know What I Like hit the top 30 in the singles chart in the UK, and it reached gold status, the album. I think is generally regarded as their most rounded and most concise album. So, what of Genesis away from those top 10? Well, their last album was Calling All Stations with singer Ray Wilson, and that really is, by that point, I think the inspiration had left the band. We Can't Dance was a big commercial success, but just far too commercial and poppy for some fans, particularly the earlier Genesis fans. And then there were 3, their first album as a trio, Collins, Banks and Rutherford, which I think is quite listenable, but doesn't quite hit the heights of some of these albums. And Abacab, a bit of a sort of, again, a new wave crossover record, which has the wonderful title track on it, but the rest of the album, again, doesn't really do it for me. And as I mentioned, their debut album, From Genesis to Revelation, which is a real oddity in the Genesis catalogue because it's full of sort of pop songs, really, sort of 60s type pop songs. They made a number of live albums, some of them really listenable, particularly I think probably Seconds Out is regarded as the best one of those. So that's my Genesis rundown. What do you guys think? What do you make of Genesis? Do you see them as two completely different bands, or do you see them as just one long journey in a band's history that's inevitably going to change with the times? Let me know what you think in the comments below. There's a very wordy one today. I was struggling to get some of those words out, but I hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you again very soon for another Rock Records review. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.